Christopher, very quickly with you?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
We can.
Perfect.
Hi, Christopher. Thanks for joining us.
Yep, and I'm sorry for being a bit late.
No problem.
Hi.
So
Hi, Christopher.
we have a fairly packed program, so I'm going to kick off and I'm going to start. So, Sukanya, is that okay?
Yes, we can start.
Yeah, thank you. So welcome everybody. Welcome to this webinar that we are doing on loss and damage. It's really one of the issues that must come up at COP27. It's one of the most important issues that needs to be discussed, but more than that, we need to get action on it. And part of the effort that we at CSE have made and are making right now is to understand the different dimensions of loss and damage, both in terms of what do we know in terms of the extreme weather events, what do we know of the science and the connection with climate change, but then what do we know in terms of how countries are suffering these losses and the plans that they are making to be able to deal with it, to be able to estimate the losses, but also to be able to find ways to be able to cope, to be able to manage. And then, of course, the biggest question for all of us now is what happens at COP27 when the issue of loss and damage needs to be firmly on the table, not just in terms of an issue, but in terms of financing and the principles of that financing mechanism. And that's really for us the big issues as we discuss this. I will start off this webinar and introduce my speakers as I call upon them with a very short presentation on the key issues that we see today as far as loss and damage are concerned. So you will hear this again, and you will also be able to download our special issue of Down to Earth on loss and damage, in which many of the questions that I have just outlined have been discussed with different experts, both from India and globally, in terms of the challenges that the world is faced with today. As we head towards COP27, this has to be the worst of times. In my editorial that I wrote for the special issue, I have called it the nightmare of all climate activists. When I was at Rio in 1992, it seemed to us that that was an age of the innocence, when you could actually think that around the corner, we would be able to cut emissions, that we would be able to avert the worst of climate change. And today, when we go into COP, we're at a time when the rich world, the industrialized world, the world that has to take drastic emission reductions is today at a point where it is worried about its own cold winter, high fuel prices, and we are seeing again a reinvestment in fossil fuel, whether it is coal, whether it is oil. And this is bad news for us because the world is not on track to reduce emissions at the scale and pace needed. The latest assessment from the United Nations says it very clearly, we are not on track. We definitely are going to breach the 1.5 degrees centigrade guardrail. But at the same time, and I think that's why this COP27 is both a time of crisis, but also of opportunity. Because never before has climate change and the impacts of climate change been so real in our world. We are seeing the nature of devastation, the scale of devastation, both in the rich world, but definitely in the poor world. And we also recognize that today we have only crossed 1.1 degrees centigrade rise from 1850. And the future, therefore, is only going to get worse. So our world is in trouble, big trouble. And this is really where, if you look at the IPCC report of 2022, and I just want to give you a quick recap, just so that we keep this in mind, that the science is absolutely clear on both the science and the politics of climate change. One, that we have a very small window to act to reverse damage, which is why mitigation has to be on the table. Two, that climate change impacts are devastating. Half the world's population is highly vulnerable to catastrophic changes, and this will get worse, much worse, what we are seeing in our world today. Third, for the first time, IPCC has acknowledged the need for equity and climate justice. And this is also because the poor in the world are worst hit. They are victims. They have not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But fifthly, and again, for the first time, the IPCC report has discussed the issue of climate change related displacement. Because as the scale and the magnitude of the disasters increase, people are being forced out of their villages, their homes, and this is going to lead to increasing insecurity in our world. Yesterday, some of you may have joined us yesterday, and I want to just repeat that CSE released a report on India 2022. We have done a detailed assessment of the scale of extreme weather events that we have seen in the country. And we have looked at it region-wise. And we have looked at it in terms of every kind of disaster, heat waves, cyclones, extreme rain events, very extreme rain events, lightning storms, cold, unseasonal weather events. And if you see the database, and I've given a link to the database, this database provides you with a picture of the big picture. And this really is important because every time we have a disaster, we see the small picture. We hear about the floods in Nigeria. We hear about the floods in Pakistan. We hear about the wildfires in Australia. But what we are not getting is the scale of the devastation that we have. When we put this database together, this new abnormal, we are now telling you that in the 9 months that we have tracked from the 1st of January to the 30th of September, India has seen close to one extreme weather event every day. We have seen record-breaking temperatures, and we have seen huge parts of the country being deluged because of very and extremely heavy rainfall. Even as I speak to you today, the south of India, Chennai, is experiencing very heavy rainfall, which is leading to floods. And of course, we know that floods leads to the loss of life, property, and livestock. But what we cannot make the link and we cannot get data for is how this variable in extreme rain is now also leading to drought situations because we don't have the ability to be able to hold the water. We also find, and this I want to take a minute to explain, because if you look at the database we released yesterday, we tell you that in 2022, we recorded the 7th wettest January since 1901. This March was the warmest ever, 3rd driest. It was the country's 3rd warmest April, 11th warmest August, 8th warmest September. We also saw, in terms of rainfall, that regions going from drought to flood within a matter of hours. Now, this is the watermark of climate change, because we know that when we measure climate change and relate it to extreme weather events, that it is not about a single event. You cannot say that any one flood in India is climate change, though the science of attribution is now beginning to even point to that. But we definitely can say that the increased frequency of these events is the new abnormal. And every region of the world is similarly hit. It is devastated by this frequency, intensity, and ferocity. I call this, and I keep repeating it, it is the revenge of nature. But what it is doing is to break the backs of the poorest who are worst impacted. And this is when we know that flood, drought, cyclones are not single-day events. They cripple people. They destroy livelihoods. They take away the development dividend, all that governments have done to invest in infrastructure. And as events get more frequent, survival becomes more difficult. People have no option but to move. Today, migration, immigration is the hottest topic in the world. And we know that as these events grow, we will see more and more desperation of people. And this is why we need to get serious about building resilience, about mitigating risk, which is the discussion on adaptation and payment for adaptation. But we also have to demand reparation, which is where loss and damage needs to be discussed at COP27. But finally, and for me, this is more important than anything else, because I think the reason why we have runaway climate change is because we have negated the principles that must guide action. Today, the Paris Agreement is a free-for-all. All countries are required to act as much as they can. But what we need when it comes to loss and damage is to come back to the principle that must guide action for an effective and equitable agreement. One, we must accept that climate change is a global problem, which demands cooperation of all. And cooperation will come when the rules are fair and just for the rich, not just for the poor. And that action must be based on the responsibility of individual countries to the stock of greenhouse gases, which in turn are leading to temperature increase and so extreme weather. Loss and damage is about payment for compensation and reparation. It is about the liability of polluters. These are very uncomfortable words, very inconvenient truths. These are not words that diplomats of the world want to discuss. They would like to discuss this in more genteel language. But the fact is, this is the reality of our world. And I want you to take a minute to look at this pie diagram, which we call appropriation. This is the percentage share of global CO2 emissions by country. Just look at the share of what we have called the orange countries, the past polluters and the present polluters, their share between 1870 to 2030, and their share of the total emissions between 1870 even up to 2030, even taking the NDCs of the United States and Europe into account. Look at China going from 13% to 17%. Look at India staying from 3 to 4%. And look at the rest of the world. The entire carbon budget and the emissions have been appropriated by countries who are today responsible for the damages we see in the world. And this needs to be on the table at Sharm el-Sheikh. So thank you very much. This is my opening, and I will now ask my colleague Akshit, who is a correspondent at Down to Earth, to give a brief overview on how we are looking at the methods of estimation of loss and damage and challenges. Akshit, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am. So I'll just share my screen and then I'll start. Yeah. So basically, I will be speaking about how estimations are currently done and what are the challenges in current estimations of loss and damage from extreme weather events, extreme weather events in particular, and from climate change in general. Extreme weather events have been happening all throughout the year. This year, we saw devastating heat waves, early and devastating heat waves in India and Pakistan.
Akshit, a little louder. We can't hear you very clearly. You need to increase the, yes.
Sure. Am I audible now?
Yes, much better.
Yeah, better. Okay, so extreme weather events have been happening all throughout the year. In the first 9 months, we saw early and intense heat waves in India and Pakistan this year. And then there were heat waves all throughout the world. In fact, in July and August, there were heat waves across 5 continents simultaneously. Then we saw the Pakistan floods. Then we saw the Nigerian floods. And even now, like we got to know just yesterday that Europe has witnessed its warmest summer, warmest October on record. So it had also experienced its warmest summer this year. So extreme weather events have been happening all throughout, and a DT analysis has showed that 10,000 deaths have happened due to these extreme weather events, and 75 million people all across the world have been affected by them. There are no consolidated figures on economic losses due to these extreme weather events, but individual extreme weather events have been assessed. And for instance, the Pakistan floods that happened over the monsoon season and peaked during August, they killed around 1,700 people and affected 33 million. And the initial estimation of this disaster was around $30 billion, which basically is kind of an underestimation because this was done by the Pakistani government, and a complete assessment, a PDNA, what we call PDNA, which I'll be talking about in detail a bit more bit later, that has not been done yet. This is only on the basis of some of the rapid assessments that have been done as of now. So we know that climate-related disasters have been causing a lot of loss and damage throughout in the past 30 years. And most of these climate-related disasters have also been attributed to climate change. For instance, just the Pakistan floods, the rainfall intensity increased in the two worst affected provinces of Sindh and Balochistan. The rainfall intensity increased by 75%. And this attribution was done by climate scientists. So we know that these events are happening only because of the historical emissions which are already there in the atmosphere. And these historical emissions, as ma'am has pointed out, are because of this pollution that the industrialized countries have been doing for the past 150 years. So in the future, by 2030, there are estimations that annual loss and damage from developing countries would be in the range of $290 billion to $580 billion. But these estimations are also not comprehensive as of now. There are other challenges and other things that have not been estimated as of now, and these estimations are going to increase much further. So what is done as of now is there are two procedures to conduct these assessments, these estimations of loss and damage. One is known as the rapid needs assessment, and the other is known as the post-disaster needs assessment. So the post-disaster the rapid needs assessment happens just after the disaster occurs, and this is mainly to provide immediate relief to the people, to the vulnerable people, to the people who have been affected by the disaster. And the PDNA, the post-disaster needs assessment, happens over a longer period of time, and it basically assesses in much more detail the economic losses due to the disaster. RNAs are also useful for countries to basically get their budget allocations in place for basically overcoming these losses, these disaster losses. PDNAs and RNAs both have similar procedures. Both are conducted by the national governments, and in accordance with the procedures that are already laid out by global organizations such as the World Bank, such as the IMF, the European Union, and the UNDRR, which is the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. So various government departments are involved, and there are, I think, 9 different sectors which are assessed, in which there is a loss of human lives that is assessed, then agricultural losses to livelihoods like fisheries, damage to infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc. But most of this estimation is only economic, and there are no estimations of non-economic losses or loss of culture, loss of language. Such estimations are not there under PDNA right now. And also, developed countries and developing countries are equipped differently to make these assessments. For instance, the European Union has its office of has its Office of Disaster Assessments, which basically assesses the data, and they get the data from the insurance industry to make the estimations of loss and damage. But the insurance industry in other developing countries is not as well entrenched, and the data is not available as much. And that is why the estimations of loss and damage over a longer period of time become extremely difficult to do, especially for a country like India, perhaps. And also the losses that are happening in the developed countries and the developing countries are a bit different. Developed country losses are mostly infrastructure losses and economic losses due to infrastructural damage, and the losses in developing countries are mostly due to loss of livelihoods and loss of lives. So what are the challenges of estimations? The cohesion between different government departments when these PDNAs and RNAs are being conducted is a big issue, which is being faced in India as well, which was faced in Pakistan as well. And also all the procedures that have been laid down by international organizations, following them by these government departments on the ground, people who are going out to survey on the field, becomes challenging for them. And it does not, as I have said before, it does not currently account for non-economic losses like loss of culture, loss of language, loss of tradition, which would be impossible to replace and assess, basically. And it also does not account for also account for loss of ecological losses, such as loss of coral reefs, loss of forests, biodiversity in general, which there are certain estimations that can be done through natural capital accounting, but those are also not very comprehensive. Other challenges are to do with slow onset processes such as droughts, sea level rise, which are also not currently estimated very well. The only example of an enhanced PDNA which has accounted for ecological losses in its procedure was done by Vanuatu in 2020 after tropical cyclone Harold, and so they accounted for the marine ecosystems losses from marine ecosystems and forests, and these ecosystem losses. Marine ecosystem losses were around $8.2 billion, and the official PDNA that the figure was only 617 million. So you can see what kind of a difference ecological losses could make to the overall estimation of loss and damage from these extreme weather events. That's it.
Thank you, Akshat. Thank you very much. And that really takes me to Christopher Bartlett. Christopher is the climate diplomacy manager. Akshat, can you? Yes. Of the government of Vanuatu, one of the most important governments when it comes to, in fact, the government which was the first to raise the issue of loss and damage at the International Forum. And Christopher is going to help us to understand not just the issue of Vanuatu, not just the issue of expectation, but also how the government of Vanuatu is really taking up the issue of loss and damage in terms of estimation, something that Akshat spoke about, something that we have been tracking as well with great admiration from afar. Please, Christopher.
This discussion, I don't think it could be more timely. I'm here in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we're just having our preparatory meetings before we kick off on what will probably be one of the most important negotiations ever to address the issue of loss and damage and finance. What I want to make very clear is that we are now experiencing some of the most terrifying impacts of climate change that we didn't think were possible in the 1990s when we established the convention, and we're only at 1.1 degrees of warming. Now, this is being played out across the world from our colleagues in Nigeria, of course, the devastating floods in Pakistan, what's happening with this horrific level of starvation from drought in the Horn of Africa, of course, the Category 5 cyclones, which are now an annual occurrence in the Caribbean, and us in the Pacific Islands who are losing literally our territorial boundaries. Our countries are being wiped off the map because of climate change. And what's different about this year is that our developed country parties are now experiencing this firsthand. And we absolutely feel the sympathy and empathy with those in Europe who are losing their lives and their livelihoods because of the devastating impacts of a failure to adequately approach climate change. Truly, we are experiencing what the IPCC has indicated as an absolute abject failure to mitigate. The Secretary General of the United Nations has just made this absolutely clear that the broken promises are now causing global human suffering. And if you put it in terms of where we are, the failure in mitigation, the averting side of the problem, as well as the inadequate support for adaptation, has led to this incredible surge in the costs and experience of loss and damage. And just looking at our goal back in the 1990s to reduce emissions, I mean, look what we've done. We continue to expand and increase emissions. Even this 1.5 degree goal that we all established in the Paris Agreement is nowhere near being met. The NBCs are so far from the reality of the situation that it's almost like the entire mitigation credibility of this convention is now brought into question. Now, when it comes to terms of financing, particularly for adaptation, we heard from the OECD again that we are short. That 100 billion arbitrary goal that the developed world set more than 10 years ago has failed again. Most of the money that's been mobilized has been allocated to mitigation. And in fact, so much of it is loans. So this is absolutely contrary to what we need. And that's why we're experiencing the levels of catastrophic loss and damage that we're seeing. So truly, it seems that people are putting profit, our leaders and decision makers are putting profit over people. Now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what Vanuatu is doing. For those of you who don't know, we're a very small country in the South Pacific. We're an archipelago, 83 islands, but only 300,000 people. And you can imagine, beautiful landscapes and very friendly communities, which we are. But unfortunately, we're also very much on the front lines of the climate crisis, with in fact all particular hazards being experienced. And Vanuatu has been ranked many years in a row as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate disasters. And our leaders have called this the single greatest threat to our development. I just wanted to highlight the two major extremes that we've experienced in the last years, two Category 5 cyclones. Now, these are not minor storms. Both of these storms caused a loss of over 60% of GDP in both cases. And in the case of Category 5 Cyclone Pam, that wiped out 96% of our food crops. So huge levels of loss and damage. When you look at the PD&A requirements of $400–500 million, what we received in humanitarian aid was a tiny percentage. And so clearly the existing systems for addressing loss and damage are nowhere near adequate. So when you hear people say, don't worry about it, it's covered by humanitarian and DRR, it's absolutely not. And who covers the cost of those loss and damages? It's the communities that are actually suffering something that they did not cause. The non-economic side of things is spoken about, it's under discussed, it's undervalued. How do you in fact put a quantitative cost on something like the loss of your coral reef or the loss of your traditional burial site? I mean, these are things that have so much value that are not being discussed in the financial equations. And this is what we did for the PD&A that was mentioned before, is we tried to bring in some ecosystem valuation into the PD&A system. And I won't go through the methodologies, but we really looked at things that were very important to communities, like water security. How much, when that river was destroyed, buried in fact, did the community lose in terms of its water security values? And this is what we brought to the table. And you heard the billions that it actually cost versus the millions that showed up in the PD&A. So what are we doing right now? Vanuatu in May of this year made a declaration of a climate emergency. And unlike many other countries that have made this declaration, Vanuatu decided to put human rights and people at the very front and center of its climate change decision making. The first thing that was done was the allocation of our fiscal space this year. The recurrent budget was slotted into different priorities. And you can see here, actually you can't see here on the slide, but climate resilience was allocated 15% of our national budget. So 15% is the same amount that our government spends in education, the same amount that we spend on health. And now we're having to put 15% of our own budget to deal with a problem that we did not create. The other thing that we've done in this declaration is to equate the climate crisis with a human rights crisis. And what we did was looked at all of our legal obligations under international law, recognizing that this UNFCCC treaty is nowhere near enough, nor is it comprehensive in terms of our legal obligations. So we said, what are we required to do to protect people under, for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child? What are we required to do to protect our women under CEDAW? What is required under the law of the sea? And with this analysis, we then have created a new nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. So it's taking international law and those legally binding obligations and putting them under the UNFCCC. So we now have 148 people-centered climate targets. Not only that, we've costed it out. Believe it or not, our NDC will cost 1.2 billion US dollars. So this is the level of climate finance that's required by developed countries to provide to us to meet our climate change needs. So how can we get other countries to do what Vanuatu has done? And our perspective is that we need to understand international legal obligations. Every single United Nations principal organ has already addressed the issue of climate change, except the UN's International Court of Justice, the world's highest court. And so what we're doing is taking an advisory case to the International Court of Justice to seek their legal opinion, guidance on how other obligations under other international laws can actually be applied to the climate crisis. Now, an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice is not litigation. We're not taking any country to court. We're not going to name any country. There's going to be no winners and losers. It's simply a clarification about how international law, all of international law, can be applied to the climate crisis. And the way that we're going to do this is to take a resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, likely in December, where all countries will be able to vote. And if we get a simple majority, then it will actually go to the International Court of Justice. Now, there's huge support for this campaign to put human rights and international legal obligations. First, from the Caribbean, the leaders of the CARICOM have endorsed this this year. Also, the leaders of the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States, and of course, the Pacific Island leaders. So now there are around 86 countries which have confirmed their support for this initiative. NGOs are incredibly supportive. There are more than 1,500 civil society organizations from around the world, led, in fact, by our Pacific Island young people. And here we are now at COP27. And for Vanuatu, what we must do, of course, is to bring up this level of ambition. We cannot have a 1.5 degree world, and certainly not anything more than that. The other important aspect for COP27 is the means of implementation. We must see these finance obligations be met by developed country parties, including finance for loss and damage, which of course will be very strongly pushing for, and then putting people first, making sure that it is about people, not tons of carbon, not degrees of Celsius, but people and human rights. So our overall goal with this campaign is to use the International Court of Justice and their advisory opinion to motivate states with their legal obligations to increase their ambition, improve their NDCs, making sure that people and human rights are at the front and center. So here we are at COP. This is our kind of calendar. We're going to release the resolution publicly on the 14th of November. So you'll all be able to see the question that will be put to the court. And this question has been devised by a whole group of countries from all regions of the world, including some high ambition European countries. The consultations will happen with UN members throughout November and beginning of December. And we're hoping for a vote as soon as December of this year. So I would invite you all to have a look at this website where you can find out more about our International Court of Justice push to bring climate change and human rights to the world stage and COP27. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That is so powerful and so important what you are doing. And we're all with you, and it really needs to make sure that this goes through. These are important principles. These are very, very tough times. And our world really needs to make sure that champions like Vanuatu get the support that they need. I will now call upon Avantika, my colleague, to give us an overview pretty much based on what Christopher said, which is what's happening on loss and damage. And then I really want Ian to help us to explain what's the financial possibility and where can we really see opportunity. Avantika?
Thank you very much, ma'am. Hope I'm audible clearly.
Yes.
Thank you, Christopher, for setting the context in such great detail. I will provide, as Sunita ma'am mentioned, I provide a very brief overview of what the very complex politics of loss and damage really are at the intergovernmental UNFCCC level. What happens at COP summits? What's happened so far? I found the simplest way to break down, I guess, the various stages of the negotiations would have been to talk about what's happened since the early 1990s, what's happening right now, and what we're expecting at COP27 and beyond. As Christopher mentioned, loss and damage was a part of UNFCCC discussions right from when the UNFCCC was about to be established. So back in 1991, Vanuatu as a nation, in fact, on behalf of the AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, the negotiating bloc, Vanuatu made a proposal to come up with some sort of a funding mechanism to address the impacts of sea level rise. So that was loss and damage in its first iteration. And the proposal at that point also alluded to payments coming from industrialized countries and being channeled towards countries who are the most vulnerable to climate impacts. Following that, through the next 30 years of climate proceedings through the UNFCCC, a few further milestones were achieved. So in 2013, the Warsaw International Mechanism was established to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change. And it had a few different functions, but these were mostly limited to more technical, managerial, administrative functions. There was a proposal to include financing under the Warsaw International Mechanism, but that didn't achieve a lot of consensus over the years through the negotiations. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was finally adopted, and it was an extremely diluted agreement that did not really enshrine the equity principles of the UNFCCC, but nevertheless, loss and damage made it into the Paris Agreement. In Article 8, it states that parties recognize the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. However, there's a caveat here where all language related to liability or compensation was removed from the Paris Agreement. So essentially, any sort of teeth that the Paris Agreement could have implemented to divert funds in the form of reparations was taken away from the Paris Agreement itself, where it refers to loss and damage. In 2019, the Santiago Network, another body, was also established to catalyze technical assistance to countries who require it. So a number of certain milestones have taken place which focus on technical, administrative, and managerial activities, but not specifically on financing to address the damages that the most vulnerable countries around the world are facing. But this has changed over the past few years, particularly last year. So that's where I'll pick up in terms of discussing the present. So last year, the largest negotiating bloc, which is G77 in China, they represent 80% of the world's population. They united in one common demand to establish a loss and damage finance facility. And this demand was put forth at COP26 in Glasgow last year. And having the G77 arrive at a common consensus, it's a huge, it's a big achievement. It's a massive block with a lot of, it's not really a monolith, it has a lot of differentiation within itself. So they put forth this demand, but the demand was pushed back by developed countries, particularly countries such as the US, Switzerland, even the European Union was opposed to it. And it was essentially watered down to a compromise. So all decisions under the UNFCCC or at COP summits are made on a consensus basis. So even if one party doesn't agree to a particular decision, the negotiations fall apart. So the loss and damage finance facility did not push through, and it was watered down, and developed countries said that they will agree to have a dialogue to discuss future possible institutional arrangements to address loss and damage. And this came to be known as the Glasgow Dialogue. Now, the Glasgow Dialogue was supposed to start this year in the UN's mid-year climate conference. I attended that, and I was a part of many of the discussions, observing the various arguments put forth by developing as well as developed countries. So on the side of developed countries, a number of points were raised. So they talked about how they are transferring a lot of humanitarian aid already. They are making donations to the International Red Cross, and that should be considered as loss and damage. Developed countries are also very much in favor of insurance-based mechanisms. One example is the Global Climate Shield, which was proposed by Germany. But all of these mechanisms are outside of the UNFCCC, the convention. And the convention it enshrines the principle of equity, common but differentiated responsibility. None of these mechanisms would be governed by that. They also raised the issue of how do we define which country is the most vulnerable. So getting into a lot of such petty nitty-gritties, whereas the fact is that all developed countries, regardless of who is the most vulnerable, should have access to such kind of aid. On the developing countries side, they raised a number of issues based on very real experiences that they had. They talked about how it's extremely difficult to rapidly access any kind of financial aid after a disaster. Insurance-based schemes come with high premiums, and many of these countries are already struggling with a debt crisis and a number of other financial constraints. So paying those premiums becomes a challenge. And they alluded to issues like how there's no funding mechanism for slow onset events, which, for example, island nations like Vanuatu are experiencing in the form of sea level rise and so on. So overall, the demand from developing countries for loss and damage finance, some of the main principles that have been talked about are that it should be linked to the polluter pays principle in accordance with polluter countries' historical responsibility. There should be predictability of funds, ease of access of funds. There should be a speed of delivery of funds after a disaster, and it shouldn't be a long, drawn-out bureaucratic process to access these funds. A lot of the funds currently are loan-based or insurance-based, but they should rather be grant-based to avoid any further debt burden on these countries. And loss and damage finance should be over and above mitigation and adaptation finance. It should be its own funding stream. And of course, the accountability offered by the convention must be applied to any future funding mechanism. So looking forward now to COP27, there are chances of some sort of a successful outcome. There are chances of a compromise, or there could be a complete breakdown of trust because developing countries at this point, after 30 plus years of negotiations, they really do not believe that the UNFCCC is serving the purpose for climate equity that it was initially created to do. So where are we at now? So a positive development was that Denmark committed 100 million kron in September towards loss and damage. And what this does is it sets a precedent to kind of address some of the very intense resistance that developed countries have had towards offering funds like this. Two of the biggest blockers in this process, the US and EU, over the past couple of months, have become more open to supporting a discussion on loss and damage, but they still aren't committing to a fund. Moreover, a large part of the developed world is occupied in the current war effort and is also plagued by an energy crisis. And I believe Ian will provide some information on this as well. So this is further affecting their willingness to offer more foreign climate aid. As of now, loss and damage has been added to the provisional agenda of COP27. And it must become a formal agenda item in order for a concrete outcome to be achieved at the end of successive COP summits. So whether or not it will be a formal agenda item, we will see on once COP27 begins. But as of now, the heads of delegation, they are in consensus that it will be a formal agenda item, and that's what all of us as civil society are also hoping for. Now, what will happen, what do we expect in terms of a compromise that is acceptable to vulnerable countries if developed countries do not budge at all on negotiations? So in the process of working on this special issue of Down to Earth, we had a number of these conversations. And some of the feedback we got is that Firstly, at least a political commitment at COP27 may be acceptable. A political commitment from developed countries to establish a finance facility, not the full operationalization of a facility, but a formal commitment. Then developing countries expressed to us that the Glasgow dialogue, which started in Bonn this year, it must be linked to the COP decision-making process. Currently, it's simply a discussion, a talk shop. So it has to be more than that. The inputs generated at the Glasgow dialogue till 2024 must be captured and must tie into a formal outcome at some point. And another sort of compromise that we heard in terms of feedback could be more climate finance, as opposed to the very meager climate finance we are getting at the moment. There are other proposals that are being tabled. So debt relief is a big call to action as we are going towards COP27. The World Bank has stated that 58% of the world's poorest countries are in debt distress. And countries are also spending many, many times more, 5 times more on external debt payments than they are on climate-related projects towards climate mitigation or adaptation. Another proposal that has been put forth are debt for climate swaps, which essentially will provide debt relief in exchange for climate investment. And a coalition led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has laid out a plan at the UN General Assembly to transform the global finance architecture. This is known as the Bridgetown Agenda. So this essentially has proposals to reform how funding is channeled through institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and how long-term funding can be secured for poor and vulnerable nations through redistribution of special drawing rights, greater investment in climate resilience, as well as other long-term instruments that will mobilize finance for carbon-cutting projects. So alternatives are being tabled. The question now is whether developed countries amidst this global crisis will actually come to the negotiating table and negotiate in good faith and actually acknowledge the demands of the developing world. So thank you.
Thank you, Avantika. Ian, if I may now call upon you. Ian Mitchell, he's the co-director of development cooperation in Europe at the Center for Global Development, and has been working, and we've been reading his writings on the issue of really how could this issue of finance be put on the table? What are the politics? What are the possibilities and the opportunities? Ian.
Thanks, Sunita, and it's been great to hear from the other speakers with some excellent overviews of where we are, I think. So I'm just going to make 4 points without slides that I hope will support the discussion. I think the first one is just to say that I think the evidence is growing and is really clear about the value of loss and damage. And we did our own research report a year ago. It didn't take a bottom-up approach. It didn't look at individual circumstances. It took a top-down approach. It said, in high-income countries, there's estimates of the social cost of carbon. If we look historically at emissions and we take sensible assumptions about that social cost of carbon, how much does that add up to? And the figures are eye-watering and kind of hard to make sense of, but some of them are, the total liability, the total debt of climate, $34 trillion, we think. For the OECD countries, the industrialized countries, it's about 15 trillion, and that's about $11,000 per head for everyone in the OECD. That's the damage that's already been done by emissions to date from those countries. So that's a very substantial amount of money. It would amount to around $190 billion a year up to 2100 just to pay off that historic amount. So I think whichever way you look at it, it's very clear that there is a liability, and it's interesting to hear Vanuatu's efforts to get that legally recognised. Now, if I shift a little bit to developed countries as they come into this COP and some of their negotiating positions, as Avantika's alluded to, the fiscal context for the developed countries is not strong. This is a period, as most of the world have, there's been a recovery of some extent from COVID, but with high government expenditure that's created fiscal pressure. There's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has pushed up food prices, and has also meant for the Western developed countries a step up in resources on defence and defence expenditure. And it's also creating a need to spend aid in Ukraine. That's not happening yet, but there's a recognition that will be a big demand on the budget. So all of those things are also contributing to a kind of economic slowdown, and meaning that fiscally countries are coming in to this COP with much less freedom than even last year after COVID. And I think the developed countries are, as you've hinted, showing some signs of recognising loss and damage. Obviously, you had Scotland last year stepping forward with a small principled amount, and this year Denmark. But I think the wider position for developed countries is they've already failed on this $100 billion per year commitment that was formally agreed at COP in 2009, but also endorsed in the Paris Agreement. They remain committed to that. They hope to do that as soon as possible. It looks like that will mainly be achieved through the multilateral development banks and in particular the World Bank. So funding that goes through the international system will be increasingly focused on climate, and that will, in the coming years, in the next year or two, mean that the 100 billion face value target has been met. But I agree with Christopher that actually, that isn't, much of that isn't really new resource. And if you look back to 2010, the developed countries are still contributing 0.3% of their incomes. That was what they were contributing to aid and development in 2010, and that's what they're contributing now. So economies have grown, finance has been shifted to climate, but the overall resources that are being reallocated from the rich world to the poor world haven't altered in terms of the share of the economy. So in a sense, that's a bit of a cautionary tale for loss and damage, in my view. So I think it will be really important to get recognition at this COP of the liability for loss and damage. But I think we do need to be careful that if we end up with a new mechanism, but without a funding commitment, then what we're going to see is more resources moved from development budgets into climate and into loss and damage budgets. And I think developing countries should think seriously about whether that's what they want. We've seen with climate finance that funds have been difficult to access. The disbursement rates are not as high as they are for development finance. So there's just a caution there that if we do end up with a mechanism, then it may reduce development finance in other budget lines without that financial commitment. So in terms of that mechanism, I do have some sympathy with some of the conversation that said, look, this could be finance that moved quicker to places that have clearly experienced an extreme event that's climate driven, and speeding up that finance cycle, I think would be valuable and is worth some effort. And even if nothing else, that also creates really solid evidence base for the size and the needs that are created by climate events. So I would definitely endorse further work on that and to have that sort of mechanism established, notwithstanding the caveat about how it's funded. Let me finish on I suppose a couple of more positive notes for what might be possible. I think I've said throughout, I think it is important that industrialized countries recognize this liability and move towards financing it. I think the requirement to agree under the Paris Agreement a new collective quantified goal is certainly an opportunity here. So after 2025, the need for a new climate finance target. And I would like to see that much better design than the previous one, genuinely creating new resources, taking into account loss and damage, maybe also making clearer who should contribute based on emissions, historic and current. So I think I'd like to see a lot of work on that from all parties and some creative thinking, rather than just doubling or tripling or quadrupling the 100 billion that we've already got that hasn't really worked to stimulate new resources. So that's one positive, and I hope we'll get some movement on that. I think the other positive that Avintinka mentioned is the Bridgetown agenda. And one of the items in that agenda is to get the international financial institutions, particularly the World Bank, but also the multilateral development banks, to basically make better use of the resources they've already got. So it would be possible for those institutions to raise more money using their credit ratings, and then to use those resources on climate, on development, on COVID recovery, on pandemic preparedness. And I think that's really the only way I see substantial new resources being moved towards these agendas in the coming years. It needs the shareholders of those organizations, which, surprise, surprise, are also the same group of developed industrialized countries, mainly, to get behind that initiative. But I think having the support and having discussion at COP, having the support of lower income countries for that could also make the difference to those plans and substantially increase the resources that are available for loss and damage, climate, and all the other needs that there are in development.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ian. That's very thoughtful. I think it's a very thoughtful points that you have made, because it is true that if we just rush about a financial mechanism, we also need to really look at what has been the history of financing in the past and what will be in the future, because all that we have seen, that $100 billion that was promised is really not coming for climate finance. Every other kind of finance has been masked and been put in the name of climate finance. And that's been one of the reasons for this huge distrust between the developing countries. Now, before I wind up and I give some conclusions, Christopher, would you like to add on to anything that you heard from Avantika, Ian, or Rakshit? You're in Sharm el-Sheikh, so you're in the hot seat. So anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this issue of finance really is going to be front and center. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see in the very first days of the negotiations that we put everything else on hold until we are very clear on how we're going to see progress on finance for loss and damage. So I would expect the G77 and the world's developed countries, the most vulnerable, to make this an absolute requirement to move forward in this process on anything. So I'm very much anticipating, this call for climate justice to be front and center here in Sharm el-Sheikh.
No, thank you. And we have a lot of questions and a lot of issues that people have raised, and I have read them all in my trying to multitask between hearing the wonderful things that Ian was saying and Christopher was saying and Avantika and Akshit, but also to read all of your comments and your notes, so you have written them. And I'll try and wrap that up to basically talk about what now and where do we go now. I mean, firstly, let's understand that we are at a time in history when all that we thought would not happen is actually happening. As I said, in 1992 at the Rio conference, and I remember the issue of loss and damage coming up, but it was something that was very far off in the future. It was when the impacts of climate change would happen. And we somehow believed, and I think we were right in having the expectation that we would avert the worst of climate change, that we would see the reduction that was required in the world in emissions, we would mitigate at the scale that was needed, and that we would find ways in the emerging countries, whether it is China, and as you saw, China has now moved from in 1992 from being a low emitter to now being a very high emitter, that the rules would be made so that all countries in the world would be forced to take emission reductions, and the developing and the countries that needed the right to grow would grow differently. That was the principle that was established in Rio in 1992. But unfortunately, and that's why we need to take stock of this today, and a real hard stock of this today, we really have seen a collective failure of global leadership. That we are today at a stage when emissions are definitely on the increase. We are going to breach the 1.5 degrees centigrade. Christopher, I totally agree. We have to keep our hopes and our push that we do not breach this, because this is a guardrail. But from all the information that we have in front of us, we are just not getting our act together. Even the countries that had agreed to reduce emissions at the scale they needed to are today reversing many of the decisions. So we need to make sure that we can keep the pressure on mitigation. Because if we lose sight of mitigation and the need for drastic mitigation, we are really in trouble. Avantika has just completed an assessment of where we stand, where each country stands in terms of their reductions between last year, this year, from the global database. And you really find that the track record is pathetic. I cannot use another word. Okay, so mitigation has to be at the center, and we need to make sure that we keep that in our sights. But as I said, there is the other part of the world which is blowing up. And we are seeing devastation at the scale we've never seen. And I really would encourage you to look at the database that we have put together yesterday, because for the first time, we went back to the data that is available in the Indian Meteorological Department and the Disaster Department under the Ministry of Home Affairs to try and piece together the extreme weather events that a country like India has seen, and the losses and damages that a country like India and the government is putting forward. It's very clear the data requires a lot more work. But what is very clear is the sheer magnitude of the scale of devastation we are seeing. And this needs to be repeated for every country in the world today. We have to move beyond just the one devastation, one disaster, the anecdotal information we have, to really be able to talk about the scale of the devastation, the big picture. And that's where we need to put the human face at the center of this discussion. And I think that's where COP27 can be different. Too many COPs we have lost in talking about technologies that don't happen, in corporate sectors promising us what they will do, but they don't deliver. I think this is a COP where the suffering, the human suffering, has to be at the center stage of the negotiations. The face of the climate victim has to be at the center stage of the negotiations, because that then brings out the principle that if we have a polluter pays principle which has been established, when you have pollution disasters, you say the polluter must pay. And you say that also as a matter of global principle lawmaking, because it is a deterrence for more pollution, which is where the question of loss and damage is about deterrence. It's about saying that if you don't reduce your emissions at the scale you're supposed to, you will have to pay reparations. And that is a check and balance in any civilized society that is there. We make laws in a way that you can have laws that make the rich and the most powerful be compliant. You don't make it for the poor, because the poor are always powerless. And I think that's the big issue in front of COP27 this time. And I really hope, and I think that's where, Christopher, the amazing work that you and your government is doing, that many other governments are doing, that the civil society is doing, that we need to make sure that we keep our voice loud. We don't lose sight of the fact that this is the time when the world has to sit up. It has to grow up. It has to understand that its actions are leading to huge impacts on people across the world. And it also has to understand that this will lead to global insecurity. So we need to address this. And I really would just like to end by saying that this is perhaps that one time in the world when maybe governments will sit up. I remember the only other COP when something like this had happened was in Bali, when the IPCC report had come out, and that told us of the apocalypse that awaited us. And it was much more clearer in terms of language. And for the first time, you felt you had an opportunity where governments are not going to find some new language, some new, full stop, comma, discussion, debate, some way to be able to divert, delay, prevaricate. This is not that moment. This is a moment when I hope grown-ups will behave like grown-ups and they will understand what the world is about. So let's all keep track of what Christopher does, what Ian does, what Avantika and Akshat will report from Sharm el-Sheikh when they are there, because we will keep the pressure on this. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And once again, for all the people who keep hearing us and reading us and being with us, thank you very much. You are our strength of support. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Christopher. Wonderful discussion. Thank you, Avantika. Thank you, Akshat. Thank you. See you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sunita. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you very much.